on behalf of the life of the world, meaning in death. He gives his flesh. And now the grumbling in verse 52, which we'll go to later, not this week, becomes disputing. It's a word in Greek that means fighting. It's getting more intense. It's a bump up a level in the conflict in verse 52, because now he's getting really particular about his flesh being eaten. Let's go back to verses 43 and 44 and see what Jesus responds, how he responds to this grumbling. Verse 43, "Do not grumble among yourselves. No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him." One of the keys to understanding verse 44 is to realize that it's a response to this grumbling. Don't grumble. You can't come unless the Father draws you. What does that mean? Let me try to answer two questions. First, what does it mean when he says, "No one can come to me unless the Father draws him"? And second, why would he say it? You know, sometimes people get on the case of teachers or preachers that they say hard things. Well, there it is. And so my question is, why'd you say that? Don't you know that causes divisions in the church? You say things like that, it divides whole denominations. It causes families to get bent out of shape with each other. It just don't. What you say something easy. So let's try to answer number one, what, and then we'll do the why question in a few minutes. What does Jesus mean when he says, "No one can come to me unless the Father who sent me draws him"? I'm going to stay in John. I was really tempted to go to about a dozen texts outside John, but let's just stay in John, and we'll work out in concentric circles from the really close context to the wider context in the book of John to try to figure out what he means by this. And I'm going to argue that the near context especially, and then the wider context in a confirming way, makes it really clear that what he does not mean is that he draws everybody. And then the humans provide the decisive impulse for who comes. That is emphatically not what he means, I'm going to argue from the text. Rather, what he does mean is everyone that he draws comes. They actually come. And the drawing is the decisive cause for their coming. It's not God's contribution and then you're decisive. God is decisive in who comes to Jesus. That's what I think verse 44 means. And let me say very clear, this is absolutely, totally, and undoubtedly not in any conflict at all with your coming freely. And by freely, I simply mean because you want to come. Right? I defined freedom last week as doing what you want to do and not regretting it in 1,000 years. Nobody comes to Jesus who doesn't want to come to Jesus. Nobody comes to Jesus who hasn't chosen to come to Jesus. Nobody comes to Jesus who doesn't come by an act of their own will. I'm just saying, when you perform that act of will, when you experience Jesus as compelling and drawing you freely to himself, there's a reason. God. Now, I'm going to give you 5 contextual reasons for thinking that's what he means. Number 1. Go back to verse 37. It's just a few verses away, 7 verses earlier. And there Jesus says, all that the Father gives me will come to me. Now, in the flow of thought from verse 37 to 44, I see no reason whatsoever for thinking that the Father's giving people to Jesus in verse 37 and the Father's drawing people to Jesus in verse 44 are different. They're the same thing. God gives people to Jesus. There. You are His. Now, you were mine, now you're His. That's what it says in John 17. Or, you stand on the other side and He draws them in. He draws them to Jesus. Only we get help in verse 37 because there it says clearly, all that the Father gives me will come to me. So I conclude, and I could just quit and go home now as far as I'm concerned, all that the Father draws come to Him. Because the drawing and the giving are virtually the same. I would be really hard put to say that the point of verse 37 and the point of verse 44 are dramatically different points. They're not. They're the same point. Number two. Drop your eyes down to verses 64 and 65. This, to me, is the even more decisive argument in the context for the interpretation that we are seeing. Here, Jesus explicitly refers back to verse 44, and He applies it in a way that makes its meaning crystal clear, I think. Namely, He's explaining why there's a Judas or other unbelievers. He says, the words that I have spoken to you, this is verse 63, at the end of 63. The words that I have spoken to you are spirit and life, verse 64. But there are some of you who do not believe. Now, John, the writer of this gospel, inserts a parenthesis and says, for Jesus knew from the beginning who those were who did not believe, and who it was who would betray Him. So Judas. So what John is saying is, when Jesus makes the general statement, there are some of you who do not believe, John says, He knows there's a Judas. He's known it from the beginning. Okay? Now we pick it up in verse 65, and here is the explicit reference to verse 44. And He said, Jesus said, this is why I told you, back in verse 44, that no one can come to me unless it is granted him, new word, same meaning, I think, granted him by the Father. Nobody can come unless it is granted. Verse 44 says nobody can come unless the Father draws. So the Father gives, the Father draws. And He's explicitly referring back to verse 44. I told you this. I'm telling you why I told you this now. I'm telling you this because of Judas. There are some of you who do not believe. And then notice the logic. This is why. You see that in verse 65? This is why, on account of this, I said back in verse 44, nobody can come to me unless the Father grants him to come to me or draws him to come to me. That's why there is a Judas. God did not draw Judas. He left him in his greed and his stealing from the disciples and his unbelief and rebellion and hardness of heart. God left him justly and didn't draw him. And that's why I said what I said. I know there's a Judas among you. This is why I told you, so that you would understand how Judases come about and don't come. A universal offer of drawing won't work here. It doesn't explain Judas. I know there's a Judas. That's why I told you God draws everybody. That doesn't work.